Well, this story of the Canaanite woman and her demon-possessed daughter is pretty obviously, in many ways, a troubling one. As a preaching text, it can actually be approached in a number of ways, and it's obviously a story of healing. Most often, that's where the focus is put. In this case, it's a healing that takes place because of another person's faith. That's obviously quite significant. And when that's the emphasis put into the preaching, the message is usually that we are to exercise that kind of faith by identifying with this persistent woman. But I suspect that that is not primarily what Matthew had in mind when he recorded this incident. Well, Matthew certainly would not have denied the importance of faith. I think it was actually trying to emphasize something else. And to see why that's so, keep in mind that Matthew, more than any of the other Gospels, was written primarily as a narrative, an instructional manual, if you will, for the benefit of the newly emerging Christian church. His gospel became kind of a confirmation class, a membership instruction. And that's apparently what he intended for it to be. In fact, Matthew's is the only gospel in which the actual word church appears. So Matthew tells this story and all the other stories of Jesus with the church in mind. And in this passage, Matthew is giving a specific message of instruction for the church. To see what that message is, let's take a closer look at the context. Now, prior to this, leading up to this whole event, Jesus and his disciples have been under a great deal of pressure, stress. They've been maintaining a demanding schedule. And most everything they've said and done has gotten a lot of negative pushback from many of the Jewish religious leaders. So they decide at this point, probably at Jesus' insistence, to get away from it all for a while, to take a much-needed rest and recuperation. And the place they choose for this spiritual retreat is the area of Tyre and Sidon, which is over on the Mediterranean coast. So you see, it's kind of like they're taking a seaside vacation. The significant thing about it, though, is that to go there, they're leaving Jewish territory and going over into Gentile territory. And maybe that's because they want to go to a place where they're not going to be recognized. They can actually get some peace and quiet. But obviously that's not the way it works out. No sooner do they cross the border into Gentile territory than this non-Jew, this Canaanite woman, this ancestor of the people who were occupying Palestine way back when the Jews first moved in. This woman recognizes Jesus and makes her appeal. Her daughter's sick. She wants Jesus to heal her. The disciples clearly are in no mood for charity. Their response is, send her away. She's following us and making all this noise. But the woman persists, and here's the troubling part. Jesus responds in a way that may be hard for us to imagine coming from his lips. He says, my mission is directed to the Israelites and to them only. Now, I want to kind of interject a sort of disclaimer here and say that my intention in this sermon this morning is not to dwell on this aspect of the passage. not to get into why Jesus might have said that. I will point out that Bible scholars have provided a variety of explanations, and for the most part, they actually question whether it was Jesus that did say that. The common assumption is that Matthew was here attributing to Jesus what was a common belief among his Jewish followers and some folks in the early church. That belief that the Messiah, when it came, and these early believers thought Jesus was the Messiah, the belief was that whenever the Messiah came, that Messiah would come only for the Jews. In fact, Jesus himself said other things that would indicate that he himself didn't take that position, but that whole thing is a matter for another Bible study. I'm thinking those of you who go to the Tuesday Bible study, ask Rex to explain that to you. He'll get into all that. So, in the text here, Jesus challenges the woman's claims on his ministry. She persists, and he declares, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." Now, if this is more than just a healing story, if it's intended to give some direction to the church, I think it can say a number of things to us. One thing it certainly says is that if the church is to follow the path laid out by Jesus, and isn't that what we're all about? If the church is to follow that path, it'll have to get involved in the suffering and the heartache of this world, wherever that suffering may be, and whatever it may entail. It'll have to go outside its own boundaries. It'll have to respond to the cries of need, no matter where those cries are coming from, no matter who they are, no matter where they are. That's simply what it means to be the church. I have a particular reason for wearing this clerical collar this morning. Most of you probably never seen me in one. And you may think about it as being something you associate with the Roman Catholic Church. But actually, there are a lot of Protestant pastors who wear these all the time, but although not so much in California. I was ordained many years ago by Bishop Gerald Kennedy, and there's a story told about Bishop Kennedy. It seems that Bishop Corson, who was the bishop of the Philadelphia area, was famous for wanting his pastors to wear clerical garb. And so he said to Bishop Kennedy one time, "Why don't you get your preachers to wear clerical collars?" And Bishop Kennedy responded, "In California, I have a hard enough time getting them to wear shoes." Well, I understand that. I'm a pretty informal guy. As a matter of fact, when I'm not here, I'm preaching a lot of different churches, and this is one of the few churches I even put a tie on for. So I can understand that kind of thinking, but there's another aspect. There's a good reason for wearing a clerical collar. I tell you, I first wore it when I was pastoring in my first full-time appointment down in San Diego. And I and some other pastors started doing a bar ministry. And we wanted to make it clear that when we went in the bar, we were not there to pick up women or to get drunk. So one way to do that was to wear a collar, and then people approached us. But when I'm not wearing a collar, people don't often pick me out of a crowd and then say, "Well, there's a member of the clergy." I just don't look that pious. I can go into the world the way those disciples probably wanted to go into Tyre and Sidon, incognito. But as soon as I put on the collar, I make myself vulnerable to Canaanite women and all sorts of other people who have needs and want to ask for help. And frankly, I'm not always ready for that or comfortable with that. There's a part of me that would rather duck that responsibility. or at least have them make an appointment and come to see me on my terms, at my convenience. My all too human inclination is to be charitable and to be giving and to be helpful when it works well for me to do so rather than according to their needs. And I suspect I'm not alone in that. I'm kind of thinking that maybe that sort of thing is true for you as well. And yet here we have an instructional story having to do with human need and an appropriate response. And what that story says is that if we are going to be the church, we have to be available, always and everywhere. You see, this is a story about faith in Jesus. But if you assume that Jesus was teaching his disciples here, and that then one of those disciples, Matthew, was in turn teaching the church, it's not only a story about what faith in Jesus can do for you, it's a story about what faith in Jesus requires of you. And what it requires is the sensitivity and the compassion and the willingness to hear a cry of human need. Clear over there in Tyre and Sidon, or in Africa, or in Latin America, or in Appalachia, or in your own backyard right here in Sun City, and do something about it. You see, once Jesus came into our world, doing the things he did, going the places he went, saying the things he said, for followers of Jesus, the world suddenly became much bigger. The world into which Jesus came was clearly drawn by boundaries. So when Jesus said, "Love your neighbor," people right away wanted to know, who is my neighbor? Neighbor could mean anybody. They wanted to make sure he meant the neighbor who lives within my boundary. The person who's like me, or is at least liked by me. The person with whom I feel comfortable. The person who doesn't make too many demands on me. And Jesus just knocked down all those boundaries. Jesus said, that's not big enough. Not nearly big enough for God's world. Since Jesus came, neighbor means anyone who needs you. Neighbor means anyone whose cry is close enough for you to hear. I think you all are familiar with the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's so much a part of our culture that we use the word or the phrase Good Samaritan in a lot of non-biblical applications. People all know that story. It's a compelling story of a man who crossed those ancient lines of separation and conflict to help someone in need. And Jesus told us that story to show us how that happens. And having told that story, here he goes into Tyre and Sidon to illustrate the point again. Only this time it's not a Samaritan and a Jew as it was in the Good Samaritan story. This time it's a Jew and a Canaanite. But one of the interesting things about this is that if you turn over into Mark's Gospel, chapter 7 in Mark, you find essentially the same story told. Only this time, it's not a Canaanite woman, it's a Syrophoenician woman. In other words, she's a Greek. You put those two stories side by side and you kind of get the idea. These gospel writers didn't have any idea who she really was. They just knew that she wasn't one of them. She was a foreigner. She was a pagan. But she was also someone in need. So if the first message for the church in this story is that we need to get involved in the suffering of the world, the parallel message is start looking upon your neighbor as anyone who needs you. The world, for those of us who would follow Jesus, is just as big as God created it. And your neighbor is not defined by geography or race or social status or any of those other artificial barriers we tend to set up. If you are a follower of Jesus, everyone in this world is your neighbor. And everyone's need is your concern. Now, don't take that lightly. Because if we're serious about this, this is one of those things that can put the church, at least the church as Jesus envisions it, at odds with much of the rest of the world. You all know very well that there are rules in this world. Many of them are unwritten, but they carry a lot of weight. And they find their way even into religious circles. And one of those rules is encapsulated in a phrase imagine you've all heard: charity begins at home. So you look out for your own kind. And by extension of that, you don't waste time and resources on the Canaanites or the Samaritans or whoever the enemy or the outsider may be. They're across the boundary. They're on the other side of the fence. They don't share our values and beliefs. They're not one of us. So we don't know if we can trust them. We don't know if we can trust them to be grateful. We don't know if we can trust them to use our help the way we think they should. We don't even know that if we help them now, they won't turn on us later. If you really want to outrage some people, tell them you're going to use church money to feed and clothe the Canaanites. That always gets somebody mad. If you want to open yourself to criticism, start giving to or doing for people who are on the other side of those boundaries which define enemy nations, or whose lifestyle and behavior are thought by good people to be offensive, or whose own attitudes and actions we can say have even gotten them into that place of need. When we talk about missions and relief work, there's always somebody to ask, whose side is that person on? On which side of the boundary does he or she live? One of my very painful memories of being a young pastor, and one of my early introductions to this kind of thinking, was back in 1975 when I was at that same church I was referring to in San Diego, and the U.S. military left Vietnam. The church was moving into Vietnam almost immediately after that exit, with medical supplies and food and clothing. Many denominations were coming together in a cooperative effort to make that happen. But people were angry about that. Some of the people in the church I was serving were very angry. And they directed their anger at me because I was helping to make that happen. People left the church over that. Our mission-minded people were saying the war's over. And these people are suffering. Maybe our compassion, our reaching out in Jesus' name will help to build a better world. And the dissenters said, but they're communists. Or did they say Canaanites? The same sort of thinking often surfaces closer to home today. It's bound to come up whenever the church starts reaching out to prisoners or to prostitutes or to drug users or to the homeless. There's always someone to say they don't deserve it. It won't do any good. Let's take care of our own kind first. But Jesus, when he walked this earth, would have none of that. And do you suppose he's changed his mind today? Remember that in telling this story, Matthew is addressing the church. So if you consider yourself to be a part of the church, you're to put yourself in the disciples' place. Jesus takes you across that border into Tyre and Sidon and lets you hear the cry of a woman in need. He reiterates the boundary set up by the world, that whole thing about Jews have no dealings with Canaanites, just to remind you of what that boundary is. And to emphasize the full revolutionary meaning of what he's about to do. And then he crosses over that boundary and heals the woman's daughter. So as far as Jesus is concerned, the boundaries are down. If someone is sick, you heal them. If someone is hurting, you help them. If someone needs you, you be there for them. That's what Jesus keeps reminding his disciples then as well as now. He keeps saying, following me is not about just feeling good, sitting around conversing with me. It's not just finding other disciples and enjoying fellowship with them. He keeps saying in a variety of ways, to be a disciple is to be sent, to be in ministry. And so he keeps telling us to go where we may not want to go, to associate with people with whom we may not want to be seen, to actively love people we might rather ignore. Send her away, his disciples say. Send her away so she'll stop following us and making all this noise. In other words, she's not one of us. She's a nuisance. She's a bother. But Jesus doesn't buy that. Jesus knows the rules of the world. He reminds us of what they are. And then he does the only thing that, given his nature, he can do. He meets her need. So if this story is addressed to the church, it's saying at least three things to us. It's saying, first of all, that those of us who consider ourselves to be a part of the church are to be involved with the needs of the world. It's saying, secondly, that anyone who is in need is our neighbor. And then this one more thing. It tells us that Jesus is not just among us here. Jesus is out in front of us, showing us where to be and what to do. All of this is in chapter 15 of Matthew's Gospel. Just one chapter over in chapter 16. Jesus will head for Jerusalem and the cross upon which he will give his life for us. Verse 21 of chapter 16 says, "From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples These disciples to whom he had taught this lesson about love and care and sacrifice, he began to explain to them that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer the ultimate sacrifice, that he must go and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, that he must be killed and on the third day raised to life. And what happens there? Again, the disciples protest. They try to protect him. They try to keep him from doing it. And this time the lead person in that is Peter. Peter, upon whom Jesus eventually builds his church, but Peter, with whom I identify so much because he is so up and down, so often not understanding. Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, for you're a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." And when Jesus said to Peter, he was not just addressing Peter, he was addressing any part of the church that tries to put up a shield around Jesus, to limit Jesus, to betray Jesus. For you see, if Jesus is our Lord, then we are to follow him. And look where Jesus goes. He goes across all of the boundaries. He goes where you and I may not want to go. Just a couple of weeks ago, Pope Francis was speaking to a gathering of hundreds of thousands of young people in Poland. And he put it wonderfully well to them. He said, "We didn't come into this world to vegetate, to take it easy, to make our lives a comfortable sofa to sleep on. No, we came for another reason, to leave a mark. Jesus is the Lord of risk, not the Lord of comfort, security, and ease. Following Jesus demands a good dose of courage, a readiness to trade in the sofa for a pair of walking shoes, and to set out on new and uncharted paths." But there are still a lot of times when I don't want to go to Canaan. And I know very well why. I don't want to go to Canaan because there's a woman over there crying for help. And I've got my own problems, my own agenda, my own needs. And yet because Jesus went there and healed her daughter, because I claim to be a follower of Jesus, that woman has a claim on me. I don't want to go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee the way Jesus did either. I don't want to go there because there's a huge crowd over there and they're hungry. They need some of my abundance. It's hard for me to sacrifice. But because Jesus went there and fed them, those people now have a claim on me. And I don't want to go to Samaria. There's a woman at a well there wanting a new life. She needs my time, my compassion, my witness. And she's not my kind. Yet because Jesus went there and blessed her, she now has a claim on me. For sure, I don't want to go to Jerusalem. I don't want to go with Jesus to Jerusalem because to go to Jerusalem means giving up everything for Jesus. Jerusalem is the place where what I profess with my words about Jesus, I have to prove with my life, and I'm not sure I'm ready for that. But if I'm going to go after Jesus, if I'm going to be a follower of Jesus, a disciple of Jesus, a Christian, isn't that what it's all about? Jesus is always going out ahead of us. And if we want to be with Jesus, we need to make sure we go with him. That means being in mission. That means reaching out. That means meeting the physical and the spiritual needs of others. And it means doing it not just occasionally, not just when we feel like it, not just when it's convenient, not just when it's comfortable, not just with those who are like us, not just when it doesn't cost us very much. It means doing it daily. It means doing it as a way of life. It means doing it wherever we are needed, wherever Jesus calls us to be. So may it be.